Chapter 15 Sloth Sighting. A short way down the block they found the source of the scream, an elderly lady who was leaning on the handles of her walker, her eyes staring into space as if they were made of glass. "That's Mrs. Fruit," Pearl told Ben as they ran toward her. "She's the oldest person in Buttonville. She doesn't like me because I broke her garden gnome." "How'd you do that?" Ben asked. The contents of the Sasquatch catching kit jiggled with his frantic steps. He was a bit worried the motion might activate the fog bomb. "It was an accident," Pearl explained. "I wanted to get a nest that was in Mrs. Fruit's tree to add to my nest collection, but it was way up in the top branch, so I climbed the tree, and then the branch broke and I fell right on top of the gnome. Its head came off." Mrs. Fruit stood in her front yard next to her white picket fence. Dozens of colorfully painted gnomes dotted her yard, as if they'd sprouted like weeds. The headless one still sat beneath the tree. Mrs. Fruit's bony fingers gripped the handles of her walker as she stared down the sidewalk. "Hello, Mrs. Fruit," Pearl said. "We heard a scream." A strangled sound emerged from Mrs. Fruit's mouth, as if a word was trying to form deep down inside her. "Sssss." Pearl poked the lady's arm. "Are you okay?" The sound got louder. "Sssss. I bet she's trying to say Sasquatch," Ben whispered to Pearl. "She must know where it is." "Mrs. Fruit, what did you see?" Pearl poked her again. "Did you see something big and hairy?" Ben asked. "Yes, yes," Mrs. Fruit said with trembling lips. "I saw a sloth." "A sloth?" Pearl and Ben said at the same time. Mrs. Fruit finally blinked. Then she took a long, wheezy breath, and her eyes went wild, spinning around like they might fly right out of her head. "A terrible, enormous, hairy sloth right here in Buttonville. It tried to eat me." "Are you sure it was a sloth?" Ben asked. He was pretty sure that sloths didn't live in North America, and he was doubly sure that if Mrs. Fruit had seen something terrible, enormous, and hairy, it was most likely the escaped Sasquatch. But events had been so strange lately he couldn't be 100% certain of anything. "Tell us what happened," Pearl said. Mrs. Fruit looked up at a tree branch that loomed overhead. "I was on my way to the senior center. It's pudding day, and I wanted to get some butterscotch before Maybelle ate it all. She's always hogging the butterscotch. But I heard a strange sound, and there it was, sitting in that tree." Ben walked around the tree, where he found a big footprint pressed into the matted grass, and there, dangling from a low branch, a tuft of brown fur. He fluffed up the grass and grabbed the fur to hide the evidence. "The sloth jumped out of the tree and snatched my sunbonnet right off my head, and then it ran toward Fur Street." Mrs. Fruit patted her white hair. "That was my favorite sunbonnet." Ben didn't point out to Mrs. Fruit that sloths are famous for moving very slowly, not for jumping or running. If she wanted to believe that a sloth had taken her sunbonnet, then so be it. At least she didn't think it was a Sasquatch. Mrs. Fruit squinted at Pearl. "Pearl Petal, is that you? Did you do this?" "Do what?" Pearl asked. "Did you put a sloth in my tree?" Mrs. Fruit wagged her finger at Pearl. "You have a reputation for trouble, young lady. You should stop messing around in people's trees." "I didn't," Pearl insisted. "Really, I didn't." "I'd better call the police," Mrs. Fruit said. "They should know that there's a sloth on the loose in Buttonville." She turned her walker and began shuffling toward her house. "Shouldn't we stop her?" Ben asked. Don't worry about it," Pearl said as she started down the sidewalk. "The police will never believe her. Would you believe it if the oldest person in Buttonville told you that a sloth had jumped out of a tree and stolen her sunbonnet?" No, Ben said as he followed. Kind of sounds like one of my stories. You write stories? Pearl asked. I tell stories. I don't write them. Oh, you mean you lie? I don't lie, Ben insisted. I tell stories. There's a difference. But his mother and father had both warned him that if he kept telling his stories instead of telling the truth, people would stop believing anything he said. Look, Pearl said. She collected a tuft of brown fur that clung to a fire hydrant. They found another stuck on a rose bush. Think we're on the right track. A horn sounded, and a blue and white police car pulled up to the curb. The words Buttonville Police Force were painted on the side. Crud. It's Aunt Millie. Act natural, Pearl told Ben. How do you act natural when you're looking for a Sasquatch? Ben wondered. The window rolled down and the police officer stuck out her head. Hiya, Pearl. Who's your friend? Hi, Aunt Millie. Pearl shuffled in place. This is Ben Silverstein. He's visiting his grandma for the summer. Hi, Ben said. Officer Millie removed her dark glasses and smiled at Ben. She had the kind of smile that showed all her teeth, even the bottom ones. Nice to meet you, Ben. Your grandpa's a swell guy. He made matzo ball soup for me when I had the flu. So, what are you two doing? You're not getting into trouble, are you? No, Pearl said, hiding the Sasquatch fur behind her back. We're just walking around. Officer Millie eyed the metal box in Ben's hand. You sure you're not getting into trouble? I'm sure, Pearl said. No trouble, Ben confirmed. Well, okay. Officer Millie slid her glasses back on. Hey, I got a call a few minutes ago that there's an enormous dog running around without a leash. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Pearl? Why would I know anything about an enormous dog running around without a leash? Pearl asked innocently. I didn't do anything. Well, maybe you didn't do anything this time. Then Officer Millie shook her head and mumbled, My niece, the troublemaker. And off she drove. How come everyone calls you a troublemaker? Ben asked. Pearl kicked a rock and then tucked her t-shirt into her shiny blue basketball shorts. I don't get in trouble on purpose. I put food coloring in Mr. Mutt's koi pond because I thought it would look pretty. How was I supposed to know that it would dye the fish, too? And I set that wind-up rat loose during the parade because I was bored. No one ever told me that ponies are afraid of rats. Pearl and Ben stopped at an empty intersection. Ben looked around for footprints and tufts of fur, but found none. His gaze traveled up and down the street. Buttonville had to be the quietest place on earth. No honking cars, no blaring music, no air traffic. The only sign of life was a man sweeping the sidewalk in front of the Buttonville clothing barn. Hey, watch it, the man yelled as a grocery cart rumbled past, nearly knocking him over. The rumbling grew louder as the cart rolled down toward Pearl and Ben. That's one of our dollar store carts, Pearl said. Someone's taking a ride. Ugh, what is that smell? Ben asked. The kids jumped out of the way as the cart whizzed past. A pair of hairy arms hung over the edge. A pair of hairy kneecaps and a sunbonnet peeked out over the top. Thanks to the slight incline of the sidewalk, the cart picked up speed. The Sasquatch, Ben said. But Pearl wasn't there to hear him. She was already in pursuit.